So let's just start with a prayer. Coming to you, Lord Jesus, isn't always easy. We sometimes want to sit in the back corner by the door, ready for a quick escape. We build ourselves up, we prepare ourselves, and then we run away only to regret it. We sometimes come full of expectation and desire, and then are unfulfilled and disappointed. Sometimes we come and hear our name being called and are disturbed yet gripped, and we cannot move. So Lord, call us now by name. Transform us and work in us and with us to bring the glory of your name. Amen. So we're continuing our series on Jesus Welcomes. And I'm privileged, although I was slightly concerned when Andrew said, I want you to do this one. It's called A Very Troubled Man. I don't think he said, and I thought of you. But that's kind of how I read it. So I'm talking this morning on the story of the troubled man, which is from Luke's Gospel, Luke 8:26 to 39. So I'm just going to start off with reading that. And I'm reading it from the NIRV, so it might be slightly different versions to some that you have. Jesus and his disciples sailed to the area of, and I always get this wrong, Gerasenes, across the lake from Galilee. When Jesus stepped on shore, he was met by a man from the town. The man was controlled by demons. For a long time, he had not worn clothes or lived in a house. He lived in the tombs. And when he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell at his feet. He shouted at the top of his voice, Jesus, Son of the Most High God, what do you want with me? I beg you, don't hurt me. And this was because Jesus had commanded the evil spirit to come out of the man. And many times the spirit had taken hold of him. The man's hands and feet were chained, and he was kept under guard. But he had broken his chains, and then the demons had forced him to go out into the lonely places in the countryside. Jesus asked him, what is your name? Legion, he replied, because many demons had gone into him. And he begged Jesus again and again not to order them to go into the abyss. A large herd of pigs was feeding there on the hillside. The demons begged Jesus to let them to go into the pigs, and he allowed it. And when the demons came out of the man, they went into the pigs, and then the herd rushed down the steep bank, and they ran into the lake and were drowned. Then those who were tending the pigs saw what had happened, and they ran off and reported it to the town and the countryside. And the people went out to see what had happened, and then they came to Jesus. They found the man who was now free of the demons, and he was sitting at Jesus' feet. He was dressed and was thinking clearly. And all this made the people afraid. Those who had seen it told the others how the man had been controlled by demons was now healed. And then the people who lived in the area of Gerasenes asked Jesus to leave them. And they were filled with fear. So he got in the boat and left. And the man who was now free of the demons begged to go with him. But Jesus sent him away. He said to him, return home and tell how much God has done for you. So the man went away. And he told the people all over town how much Jesus had done for him. So this is an incredible passage and an incredible situation for so many reasons. Not just the miraculous healing. So I wanted to unpack this passage a little bit at first, just to set the scene for what's happening and why this miracle goes beyond the troubled man himself. Now, I have apologized to Daniel already this morning. I'm doing the Theology for Life course at St. Padan's, which is making me read the Bible in a very different way. So if I get a little bit too historical, throw something at me and I'll stop and I'll move on. So first, we need to understand a little bit about Gerasenes. Now, this was a Gentile area. It was filled with citizens who were more Greek than Semitic. So here we have a situation happening where Jesus is already showing God's love and his new covenant with all the people, not just with the Jewish community. It's important to know that, because what it also does is it explains why there are pigs in this story. So why pigs? Well, pigs are considered unclean animals in the food of Judaism. So according to Torah, and we see it in the Bible as well, for an animal to be kosher, to be fit to be eaten, for a Jew it must chew its cud and have split hooves. Now, pigs have split hooves, but they do not chew their cud. So pig meat, or anything to do with a pig, are not eaten by those of the Jewish faith. Yet here we see pigs are totally central to the healing. And they are there because this is a Gentile land. And those pigs are sacrificial because they're considered unclean in the Old Testament sense. Now here's the history bit. They may also have represented the uncleanliness of the people there. Now, at the time that Luke was writing the gospel, there was huge political upheaval. The Roman legion, which had suppressed the Jewish revolt in AD 66-70, which is roughly when this was being written, and during which they had destroyed the temple, was called the Legio Exfrentensis. Now, their symbol was that of a boar, a wild pig. So not only does the boar and the pig symbolize the violence of that legion in practice, but as an unclean animal, it also represented to the Jewish audience that pollution that was being brought into the land by those occupying forces. It's a political message in here. Now, reflecting on how Jesus saves believers from the demonic, we shouldn't then just underestimate that political symbolism. We shouldn't imagine that the demonic is just about a personal situation. It's embedded in power and it's embedded in systems. And part of what Luke and this story is pointing us to understand is that whilst we want to see the healing of an individual, what Jesus is reaching out to do is to heal the whole of society. So here's our scene. We have a place and a people who are separated from God in so many ways. And here is Jesus, who meets a man whose behavior is the completely opposite of normality. He's got demons. Demons in that culture were understood to be spirits, attitudes and behavior that rebelled against God by causing people to defy the orderliness of creation and normal living. Now, this poor man, possessed by demons, is naked. He's unable to live in a house or in the town. It's a picture of complete desocialization and therefore a loss of humanity. Because that biblical view of humanity is a social one. It's about being together. It's about being in fellowship. So this man is socially dead, which is why he lives amongst the tombs. And that's the very essence of demonic in the New Testament sense. It's always something that dehumanizes someone, damages or makes them less of a person, depriving them of the fullness of life. There's no such thing as a harmless demon. So the community's reaction to this man is to restrain him with chains, but it doesn't work. And he escapes to the lonely places in the countryside. He's exiled. He's alone with his demons. He's cast out. He's rejected. And then Jesus takes the initiative. And that's in stark contrast to the community. He reaches out to relate to him. We hear in the reading, he calls him by his name. Now, culturally at the time, knowing someone's name enables you to initiate a relationship. It gives a sort of power over that person because it removes the barrier of anonymity. And the man answers that his name is Legion, which in this case means many demons, because he was possessed by many demons. And this is a rare instance of a Latin word being used in the mostly Greek New Testament. And again, Legion reflects back to the situation that everyone was in at that time. The Roman occupation and that need to cleanse the land to make it God's people's. Jesus sat with the man. He had compassion and he released him from those destructive forces. And he banished them into the pigs nearby, who, as we heard from the reading, ran over a cliff into the lake. And here again we see Jesus banishing the forces of evil and destruction into the symbolic waters of life. That man is no longer bound. He's freed and he returns to normality. He's restored to his rightful place. And he begs to go with Jesus. But this was not his calling. His calling was not to be a disciple, to follow Jesus in that sense. His calling was to go back and to talk to others, because sometimes it's easy to share your faith with the people who are nearest to you, to closest to you, but to share it with people who have cast you aside, to share it with strangers is much, much harder. And that's what Jesus was asking him to do. Go back to the people who cast you aside and tell them of God's love. Now, we see the community react very differently. They recognize how different their reaction has been and is towards the man. They tried to bind him, they tried to exclude him, whereas Jesus brought him in and freed him from the forces that separated him from God. Now, they were fearful then. You can imagine that community are thinking, yeah, we've thrown this man out. And here comes Jesus, and he's brought him in, because what's going to happen to us now? We've cast him aside. If they confronted the forces that separate the man from them, what happens to the forces that separated them from God? The people are intimidated by both the unnatural deaths of the pigs and by Jesus' power. Now, the sight of that man being well should have been a revelation to the power of God. And perhaps, though we can't know for sure, the testimony of the healed man may well have turned others towards God. It's likely he became a herald to the power of God's new covenant for all people. But the people of the area were not open or prepared for what they saw. So they asked Jesus to leave them. And I love that line. There's been this amazing transformation, amazing miracle, and they've all popped up and had a chat with Jesus and said, we want you to go now. It's hard to imagine that situation, isn't it? And Jesus, there's no fight. He just does. He gets back on the boat and he leaves. Because the people must be ready to be with him. People must be ready to accept God in order to have received that grace and that healing. They can't face having the rebellious elements in their community transformed by Jesus, and they remain closed to renewed life in him. Now, I'm a teacher, and I have spent most of my career working with young people, children, young people, with special and additional educational needs. and reading this passage affects me really deeply. We are currently in a crisis of mental health and educational need in our schools and in our communities, in young people and in children all over the world. There's a significant need, a cry for help for so many young people, but we know also there isn't an infrastructure to help that. And we also have to ask where we stand in that need. Now, I've been privileged to work alongside children and young people with some of the most extreme needs. Young people whose neurodiversity, whose trauma, whose social and emotional needs aren't always fully understood. And they often result in what can be referred to, or what are often referred to nowadays, as meltdowns. Behaviour that is physical or away from the norm. Physically fighting off those people who are there to support them or those who are near them. Shouting, screaming, breaking things. I've been bitten, punched, kicked, spat at, sworn at, verbally abused, and had many items of furniture thrown at me and in my general direction. And I've had to physically restrain young people, obviously with the proper training, because it's the last resort to protect them from harming themselves. Yet at the end of each of those episodes of explosion, by and large, what you're left with is, when that meltdown ends, someone who is broken, someone who is frightened, someone who is upset, and someone who needs love. A young person with a name who needs help, who needs guidance, and needs someone to understand them in their situation. And so often, those young people become isolated, alone, and fearful for themselves, and often of themselves, and what could happen next. So, like in our reading today, often the community backs away from them. They can become outcast, and someone needs to reach out to them and to advocate for them with grace, just as Jesus did for the man who called himself Legion. God's grace is risky, and perhaps even scandalous at times. And this is true all the way through Jesus' work, you see, throughout the New Testament and in our world today. His grace and his love is risky. And we are called to step out and speak out against all of the injustice that we see. We've got a calling to reach out to others, to meet them in their own place, to show them that the love of God is there for them through our words and our actions and through our lived lives. Now, we don't have to stand on the national stage or the international stage. There are ways that we can approach that amongst our friends, amongst our acquaintances, our work colleagues. And you do such amazing work in your community that opens the door to people to be able to come and be with you. We can show God's love to everyone we meet, and with the same aim: opening the door, being the light. But we have to challenge ourselves a little bit. And we have to challenge the perceptions of others about how we deal and approach and support the marginalized and the outcast. So how do we open our hearts and our minds to follow Jesus' commandment to love one another and to bring Jesus' love into the lives of those who are not readily welcomed into our lives and into the church? how do we show Jesus welcomes? Well, we start by clearing our own preconceptions. It's not our place to judge. That's God's job. Our place is to listen. To listen to that person's name. And to begin a conversation so that we understand where they are, not where we think they are. Jesus always starts a conversation. He always sees someone with need. And you notice that through all of his encounters that we read about in the Bible. Jesus knows that he's going to encounter someone, and so he goes there. He doesn't wait for people to come to him. There's always a purpose. There's always someone he knows that he needs to interact with for a very good reason. That's what he asks us to do. To see the people who are far away and then begin a conversation. Find out who they are. Find out their situation. And then reach out. And just as Jesus does in the example we've read this morning, we then need to believe in the power of God to make change. We need to pray, we need to gather around those people, and we need to stretch out our arms to say, Lord, make a change here. And then we need to be the good witnesses. We need to point them towards Jesus. We need to show them his light through our actions, our words, and who we are. So when we leave the service today, in our working, in our schools, in our daily lives, we are meant to witness for Jesus. And we're meant to proclaim him at every opportunity that we can. Now, it isn't easy. And the role of the family, the church family, is to encourage and strengthen each other to be able to proclaim Christ in all that we do. To worship in our every action, to be the best that we can be for Jesus, and to let our light shine. So by listening, by naming and understanding, by starting a conversation, believing in the power of God, and being a good witness, we can change lives. We can create change in our community and in our world. We can love the loveless, we can tackle injustice, and we can stand up and speak out to proclaim God's never-ending love and salvation in our broken world. Just as we saw Jesus do with that man. He opened the door. He shone the light. He got to know him, and he welcomed him in. And that's what we are asked to do.